Plotinus, Ennead 1, Tractate 1. What is the living being, and what is the human being? Pleasures and pains, feelings of fear and boldness, appetites and aversions, and feelings of distress, to what do these belong? In fact, they belong either to the soul or to a soul using a body, or to some third thing that arises from a combination of these. And this can be understood in two ways, either as a mixture or as something different that arises from the mixture. It is the same for what arises from these states, namely actions and beliefs. So then, we must investigate discursive thinking and belief to determine whether they belong to that to which the states belong, or whether some of them are like this and some are not. And we should also reflect on how acts of intellection occur, and to what they belong, and indeed what is the thing which is itself considering the investigation of these questions and making the judgment. But before that we should ask, what is the subject of sense perception? It is appropriate to begin from there, since the above states are either acts of sense perception, or else they do not occur without sense perception. First, we need to understand if it is the case that soul is one thing and the essence of soul another. For if this is so, soul will be something composite, and there will at once be nothing absurd in its being the subject, of these kinds of states, and in general of better and worse habits and dispositions. That is, assuming the argument will turn out this way. In fact, however, if soul and the essence of soul are identical, soul would be a certain form incapable of being subject of all these activities that it imparts to something else, but would have the activity that is natural to itself in itself, whatever the argument reveals this to be. In this case, it will be true to say that the soul is immortal, if indeed that which is immortal and indestructible must be incapable of being affected. It would somehow give what belongs to itself to another, while receiving nothing from anything else, or only so much as is present in the things prior to itself, things from which it is not cut off, since they are superior to it. Now, what would something of this sort fear, since it is not subject to anything outside it? So that which is afraid is that which is capable of being affected. So it does not feel courageous either, for how can courage belong to those things to which what is fearful cannot be present? And how can it have appetites, which are satisfied by means of the emptied body being filled up, since that which is emptied and filled up is different from it? And how could soul be the product of a mixture? In fact, its essential nature is unmixed. How could other things be introduced into it? If this were to occur, it would be on the way to not being what it is. Being distressed is even more remote from it, for how can something be pained except in regard to something? But that which is simple in substantiality is self-sufficient, inasmuch as it is stable in its own substantiality. And will it be pleased if something is added to it, when there is nothing, not even any good, that can augment it? For what it is always. Further, it will perceive nothing, nor will there be discursive thinking nor belief in it. For sense perception is taking on a form, or also a corporeal state, and discursive thinking and belief supervene on sense perception. Regarding intellection, if we are going to understand this as being in soul, we should examine how this happens, and regarding pleasure, pure pleasure, whether it has this when it is by itself. But as for the soul that is in the body, we should also examine whether it exists prior to this or only in this, since it is from the combination of body and soul that the entire living being is named. If then, on the one hand, it uses the body as an instrument, it does not have to be the subject of states that come through the body, just as craftsmen are not the subjects of the states of their instruments. On the other hand, perhaps it would necessarily be a subject of sense perception, if indeed it must use this instrument for cognizing the states arising from sense perception of what is external. Seeing is, after all, the use of the eyes. But there are injuries associated with seeing, so that there are also pains and distress, as is generally the case for everything that happens to the body. So too there are appetites in the soul seeking care for this instrument. But how will the states go from the body into the soul? For though body will transfer its own states to another body, how will body transfer anything to the soul? For this would be equivalent in a way to saying that when one thing experiences something, another thing experiences it. For so long as what uses the instrument is one thing, and the instrument it uses is something else, each is separate. At least anyone who posits the soul as using the body separates them. But prior to their separation by the practice of philosophy, how were they disposed? In fact, they were mixed. But if they were mixed, it was either like a blend or like an interweaving, or like a form not separated from the body. or the form controlled the body like the pilot of a ship, or one part of it was one way and another part the other. I mean that one part was separated, the part that uses the body, and the other was somehow mixed with it, that is, it belongs among the ordered parts of that which is used. Thus, what philosophy would do is to turn this part towards the part that uses the body, and to divert the part that uses the body, to the extent that its presence is not entirely necessary, away from what it uses, so that it does not always use it. So, let us suppose that they have been mixed. But if they have been mixed, the inferior element, the body, will be made better, and the superior element, the soul, will be made worse. The body will be made better by participating in life, and the soul will be made worse by participating in death and non-rationality. Indeed, how could that which has to any extent been deprived of life acquire the added power of sense perception? On the contrary, the body, by receiving life, would be what is participating in sense perception and the states that arise from sense perception. So it is the body that will desire, for this is what will enjoy the objects of its desires, and fear for itself. For it is this that we fail to acquire pleasures and will be destroyed. We should also investigate the way the mixture occurs to see if it is perhaps impossible, as it would be if someone said that a line was mixed with white, that is, one nature mixed with another of a different sort. The concept of interweaving does not imply that the things interwoven are affected in the same way. It is possible for that which is interwoven to be unaffected, that is, for the soul to pass through and not have the states of the body, just like light, especially if it is in this way woven through the whole. It will not, then, have the states of the body just because it is interwoven. But will it be in the body in the way that a form is in matter? If so, then first it will be like a form that is separable, if it is indeed a substance, and even more so if it is that which uses the body. But if we assume it to be like the shape of an axe that is imposed on the iron, and the complex that the axe is will do what iron so shaped will do, because of its shape, we would in that case be even more inclined to attribute to the body such states as are common, that is, to this sort of body, to the natural instrumental body having life potentially. For Aristotle says that it is absurd to claim that the soul is doing the weaving, so that it is also absurd to claim that it has appetites and is in pain. These belong rather to the living being. What we should say is that the living being is either a certain kind of body, or the conjunction of body and soul, or some other third thing that arises from both of these. But whatever is the case, either one must preserve the soul's unaffected state while it is the cause of the other part of the conjunction being affected, or else it must be affected along with the body. And in the latter case, its affection is identical to the body's, or it is affected in a manner that is somehow the same. For example, if the living being's appetites are other than the acting or being affected of the faculty of appetite of the soul. The body that is of this kind should be examined later. But how, for example, is the complex able to feel pain? Is it because the body is disposed in this way and the state penetrates up to sense perception, which has its culmination in the soul? But it is not yet clear how sense perception works, and whenever the pain takes its origin in a belief or judgment of some evil being present either to oneself or to something one cares about, is there then a painful change in the body and generally in the entire living being? But it is also not yet clear what is the subject of belief, the soul or the complex. Next, the belief about some evil does not include the state of pain, for it is possible that when the belief is present, the feeling of pain is completely absent. Or again, it is possible for the feeling of anger not to be present when the belief that we have been slighted is present, or again, for a belief about what is good not to move one's desire. How then are states common to body and soul? In fact, it is the case that appetite belongs to the soul's faculty of appetite, and spiritedness belongs to the soul's faculty of spiritedness, and generally the inclination towards something belongs to the soul's faculty of desire. In this way, though, they will no longer be common, but belong to the soul alone. But in fact they belong to the body as well, because blood and bile must boil, and somehow the body must be disposed to move desire in the direction of, for example, sexual objects. Let us agree that the desire for the good is not a common state, but belongs to the soul alone, as is the case with some other states. No account will attribute all of these to both in common. But the human being who has the appetite will be the one having the desire for sexual objects, though in another way it will be soul's faculty of appetite that has the appetite. How? Will the human being initiate the appetite, and will the faculty of appetite follow after? But in general, how could a human being have an appetite when the appetitive faculty has not been moved? In that case, it will be the faculty of appetite that initiates it. But where will it start from if the body is not first disposed in this way? Perhaps it is better to say generally that it is due to the presence of powers that things that have these act according to them, while these powers are themselves immobile, providing to the things that have them the ability to act. But if this is so, when the living being is affected, the cause that endows the complex with life is itself unaffected by the states and activities that belong to that which has them. But if this is so, living will in every way belong not to the soul, but to the complex. In fact, the life of the complex will not be that of the soul, and the power of sense perception will not perceive, but rather that which has the power. But if sense perception is a motion through the body having its culmination in the soul, how will the soul not perceive? In fact, when the power of sense perception is present, it is by its presence that the complex perceives what it perceives. If, though, the power will not be moved, how will the complex still perceive when neither the soul nor the psychical power are counted together with it? In fact, assume that it is the complex that perceives, due to the presence of the soul, which is not the sort of thing that can make itself a part of the complex or of the other part, but which can make something else from a body of this type and a kind of light emitted from itself, namely a different nature, that of the living being, to which sense perception and other states proper to a living being are said to belong. But then, how is it that we perceive? In fact, it is because we are not released from such a living being, even if other things more honorable than us are present in the complete substantiality of the human being, which is made of many parts. But the soul's power of sense perception should not be understood as being of sensibles, but rather of the impressions that arise from sense perception, and which are graspable by the living being, for these are already intelligible. So, sense perception of externals is a reflection of this grasp of impressions, whereas this grasp of impressions is truer in substantiality, since it contemplates only forms, without being affected. Actually, from these forms, from which soul alone has already received its leadership over the living being, come thoughts, beliefs, and acts of intellection. And here indeed is where we are. The things that are prior to these acts are ours, while we ourselves, controlling the living being, are actually located here and higher up. But there is nothing against calling the whole a living being, with the lower parts being mixed in, although the true human being begins about there with thought. Those lower parts are the lion-like and generally the multifaceted beast. Given that the human being coincides with the rational soul whenever human beings engage in calculative reasoning, it is we who are reasoning because the results of these acts of reasoning belong to the soul. But how are we related to the intellect? By intellect, I do not mean that condition that the soul derives from the entities that accompany the intellect, but the intellect itself. In fact, we have this even though it transcends us, but we have it either collectively or individually, or both collectively and individually. We have it collectively because it is indivisible and one, that is everywhere identical. We have it individually because each one of us has the whole of it in the primary part of the soul. We have the forms, then, in two ways: in the soul, in a way, unfolded and separated, but in intellect, all together. But how are we related to God? In fact, it is astride the intelligible nature, that is, over real substantiality, whereas we are in third place, being made, Plato says, from the indivisible substantiality, which is above us, and from the divisible substantiality found in bodies. We should actually think of souls as divided within bodies because soul gives itself to corporeal magnitudes, however large each living being may be, even as, being one, it gives itself to the whole universe. Or else because it is imagined to be present to bodies as shining on them, and makes living beings not out of itself and body, but while remaining in itself by giving off reflections of itself, like a face in a multiplicity of mirrors. The first reflection is sense perception, which is in the composite. Next after this is what is said to be another type of soul, each always coming from the previous one. It ends in the generative and growth faculties, or generally in what produces and is perfective of something other than what productive soul makes, given that productive soul is directed to its own product. So, the nature of that soul of ours will be released from being responsible for the evils that a human being does and suffers. These belong to the living being, the composite, that is composite in the manner stated. But if belief and discursive thinking belong to the soul, how is it inerrant? For belief can be false, and many evils are committed on the basis of false belief. In fact, evils are done when we are overcome by what is inferior in us, for we are many, either appetite or spiritedness or an evil mental image. That which is called thinking of falsities is imagination that has not waited for the judgment of the faculty of discursive thinking. But in that case we acted under the persuasive influence of something inferior. It is just as in the case of sense perception, when we see falsely by our common faculty of sense perception before the discursive faculty makes a judgment. But the intellect has either been in contact with its object or not, so that it is inerrant. In fact, we should say that we are, in this way, either in contact with the intelligible which is in intellect, or we are not. Actually, we are in contact with the intelligible in us, for it is possible to have it, but not to have it at hand. We have indeed distinguished what belongs to the composite and what are properties of soul. What belongs to the composite are the things that are corporeal or do not exist without a body, whereas what does not need a body for its activity is a property of soul. Discursive thinking, when it makes a judgment on the impressions that come from sense perception, is at that moment contemplating forms, that is, contemplating them with a sort of self-awareness. This is, at any rate, principally the case for the discursive thinking of the true soul. For true discursive thinking is an actualization of acts of intellection, and there is often a sameness or commonality between things external and internal. The soul then will be no less quiet and turned inward, that is, to itself. The changes and the tumult in us coming from the things that are entangled with us, from the states of the composite, whatever exactly that is, are as we have said. But if we are the soul and we have these experiences, the soul would have them, and again it will do what we do. In fact, we said that the composite belongs to us, especially when we are not yet separated from it, since we say that we experience the states of our bodies. The term we, then, is used in two ways, referring either to that which includes the beast or to that which is at the same time above this. The beast is the body that has been vivified. But the true human being is other, purified of these corporeal states and possessing the virtues that are found in the activity of thinking that is actually situated in the separated soul, separate and separable even when it is in the sensible world. For whenever it removes itself completely, the inferior part of the soul that receives its illumination goes away too, following after it. But the virtues that do not belong to thought apply to the custom and training of the composite. For the vices belong to this, since occasions of envy and jealousy and compassion do so too. What do occasions of love belong to? In fact, some belong to the composite, and some belong to the interior human being. When we are children, the faculties of the composite are active. There is little illumination of it from the things above. Whenever they are inactive in us, they are acting in relation to that which is above. But they act in us whenever they reach what is in the middle. What then? Is not the we prior to this middle ground too? Yes, but there has to occur an apprehension of what is prior. For we do not always use that which we have, but we only do so when we arrange the middle, either in relation to that which is above, or in relation to the opposite of this, or in relation to such potencies or dispositions we take steps to actualize. But how do beasts have animality? In fact, if the souls in them are, as it is said, human souls which have erred, the separable part of the soul does not belong to the beasts. It is there, but it is not there for them. Rather, what they have self-awareness of is the reflection of the soul that goes with the body. Actually, such a body has been, in a way, made by a reflection of soul. On the other hand, if the soul of a human being has not entered it, it becomes the kind of living being it is due to the illumination coming from the soul of the cosmos. But if the soul is inerrant, how can there be punishments for it? Yet this line of reasoning is inconsistent with every argument that says that the soul errs or acts correctly and undergoes punishments, both in Hades and via reincarnation. One ought to associate oneself with whichever line of reasoning one wishes, but perhaps we can discover a way in which they do not conflict. The line of reasoning that makes the soul inerrant assumes that it is one and totally simple, claiming that soul and the essence of soul are identical. The one that allows that the soul can err interweaves and adds to it another form of soul, which is in these terrible states. The soul then is a composite of all these things and is actually affected as a whole, and it is the composite that errs, and it is this which undergoes punishment, not the other. Hence Plato says, "We have gazed upon soul like those who have seen the sea-god Glaucus." But if someone really wants to see its nature, he says, he must knock off the accretions and look at its philosophy to see what it adheres to, and what it owes its kinship to, such that it is the sort of thing it is. The life and other activities of the soul, then, are one thing, what is punished another. The withdrawal and separation of the soul is not only from this body, but also from its accretions, for the accretion occurs during generation. In fact, generation belongs to another form of soul entirely. How the generation takes place has already been explained. It is because of the soul's descent, when something else arises from it due to its declination. Does it then abandon its embodied reflection? And how is the declination itself not a moral error? For if the declination is an illumination of what is below, it is not a moral error, any more than what remains in shadow is. What is illuminated is responsible, for if that did not exist, the soul would not have anything to illuminate. To descend or to decline, then, means that what is illuminated by it is so because it shares its life with it. The soul then abandons its reflection if there is nothing nearby to receive it, but it abandons it not by being cut off, but because the reflection no longer exists. And it no longer exists if the whole soul is looking to the intelligible world. The poet seems to be separating the reflection in the case of Heracles when he puts it in Hades, but places Heracles himself among the gods. Maintaining both stories, namely that Heracles was among the gods and that he was in Hades, he then divided him. Perhaps the account would be plausible if the idea is actually that Heracles had practical virtue and was thought worthy of being a god due to that excellence, but because his virtue was practical and not theoretical, in which case he would have been entirely in the intelligible world, he is above, though a part of him is also still below. That which has investigated these matters, is it we or the soul? In fact, it is we, but by means of the soul. How have we done this by means of the soul? Is it by having that which was being investigated, namely soul? In fact, it is insofar as we are soul. Is it then in motion? In fact, we should attribute to it the sort of motion that is not corporeal but belongs to its life. And intellection is like this for us because the soul is intellectual, and intellection is its better life, when the soul thinks or when intellect is active in us. For this is also a part of us, and it is to this that we ascend.